Okay, hi guys. Can you guys hear me? Okay, today is day two, so we're gonna do unit two today. And then remember, uh, I'm lecturing for the next 3 days, and we're gonna cover unit three, four, and five on those days. Um, I'm Calico, and I'm going to be lecturing AP Psychology this AP testing season, I guess. Each lecture should be around an hour and a half, but some will be longer, some will be shorter. At the end of today's lecture, we're going to do a Blooket. Hopefully it works. Okay, like last time, before we start, I have to tell you guys about Five Hive. We are a volunteer organization led by Lance. We have over 70 volunteers and more than 10,000 combined volunteer hours. And we basically just make AP resources for students taking AP classes. You can find them on our website at fivehive.org, and you can also join Five Hive by looking at this document I'm going to send in chat right now. So we have a ton of teams. We have like material team, lecture team, outreach team, data team, website team. Also, we look at applications on a rolling basis. So even if you don't have time to join Five Hive and do work right now, you can always apply and join in the future. Um, Five Hive is not affiliated with College Board or their AP trademark. Also, please try to keep the chat on topic today. Also, I'm going to ask you guys to respond to questions sometimes. And when I do, please answer them by turning on spoiler mode, which you can do by doing /spoiler or doing 2 lines on each side of your answer. Okay, let's start off by talking about bottom-up processing and top-down processing. So bottom-up processing is when you use sensory details to build understanding from scratch. Typically, we use bottom-up understanding when we come across something entirely new. Let's take the example of a child in a puddle. If a child comes across a puddle for the very first time, they might step in it and build an understanding based on their senses of sounds, vision, and touch that stepping in the puddle got them wet, and it might do that again to them in the future. Top-down processing is when we use past experiences or our prior knowledge to understand something. Here, the child might remember the last time that they stepped in the puddle, that they got wet and in trouble with their parents. Therefore, they know that stepping in puddles could get them wet or dirty, so they might choose to avoid them. Schemas are an idea developed by Jean Piaget, which are basically simple frameworks that help us interpret and categorize things. So, for example, my schema of a dog is that it's fluffy and it barks and it has 4 legs. Perceptual sets are basically when we have expectations of what we will perceive in the future. Perceptual sets can cause us to see what we expect to see. What I mean by this is that if your friend tells you someone from school is mean, if you're having a conversation with that person, you might begin to perceive some of their comments as rude even if they were actually neutral. Some external factors that can influence your perception are personal experiences and cultural influences. Your personal experiences can create biases, expectations, and emotional associations. Cultural influences can create social norms, influence the things you value, and impact your interpretation of gestures. For example, if an American tourist goes to Japan and tips the waiters, the American tourist might perceive that as a kind gesture, while the waiters might interpret it as rude due to cultural differences. Okay, let's do a practice question based on those 2 slides. Mia is brand new to Minecraft and has no idea what to do. After playing around with the controls for a while, she finds that breaking items will drop them, and all of the animals she encounters are friendly. Identify the type of processing in Mia's perceptual set. Mia's a noob? Maybe. Also, make sure to use spoiler mode this time. Mia is on peaceful mode. Is that the answer? Okay, you guys all say bottom up processing. Can someone tell me the perceptual set? Do we need a refresh on what a perceptual set is? Maybe. Okay. Oops. Okay. Um, Perceptual sets are basically our expectations of what we will perceive. So if we expect to see something, we might begin to interpret what we see as that thing because we want it to match our expectation. My example was if someone tells you someone you're going to encounter is rude. So let's say like your friend tells you that your coworker is really rude. When you're talking to that coworker, you might begin to perceive what they're saying as rude even if they really aren't being rude. Okay, so let's go back. So what is Mia's perceptual set? What is her expectation? All mobs are friendly and breaking drops items. Yeah, perfect. So we know that this is bottom up processing because she was brand new, first of all, and then she used all of her experiences to build understanding of the game. And then from her experiences, she builds the perceptual set that breaking items drops them and animals she encounters are friendly. We know that, well, most of us know probably that not all animals in Minecraft are friendly. So that explains why sometimes perceptual sets can lead us to misinterpret things. Do we have any questions? Pavlov is not in this unit. Pavlov's the dog. Okay. Okay. Let's move on to Gestalt principles. We are constantly taking in so much sensory information, like from the way your clothes feel on your skin, which is something you don't really think about, and to like how the sunlight is reflecting and affecting your vision. In order to function properly, we need. Why am I on the wrong side? Oops. Guys, I was looking at my notes from the other side. Okay. um, Gestalt psychology and Gestalt principles basically show us how we organize visual information. And the biggest takeaway I need you to have from Gestalt psychology is that it suggests we perceive things as patterns instead of individual subjects. So there's 4 Gestalt principles you need to know, which is closure, figure ground, proximity, and similarity. Closure says that our mind is able to complete incomplete shapes and patterns and fill in the gaps. For example, right here, even though there's like gaps in the shapes, we still perceive this as a full circle and this as a rectangle. Figure ground is the separation of a figure and its background. So here, if you choose the background to be black, you're going to see 2 faces, and if you choose the background to be white, you're going to see a vase. Proximity says that things that are close together, we tend to put into groups. So since the vertical gaps are bigger than the horizontal gaps, we perceive this as 3 horizontal rows or 3 horizontal groups as opposed to 12 individual dots. Similarity says we group things that are similar looking. So here we have 2 groups, one made of darker dots and one made of lighter dots, and Gestalt principle proposes that we perceive it as 2 groups, one of light dots and one of dark dots. Okay, this was back to my thing. We're taking in a ton of sensory information, and in order to function properly, we need to use attention to block out information that isn't useful. So for example, like the way socks feel on your feet or the way clothes feels on your skin isn't particularly useful, and if we were constantly thinking about things like that, we probably wouldn't be able to make meaningful choices and decisions. So attention is important because it basically acts like a filter for all the information we process. Selective attention is when we focus on one specific stimuli. One example of selective attention is the cocktail party effect, where you're able to pick out important verbal remarks in a setting where there's multiple ongoing conversations. This is like if you go to the mall and you're being nosy and you're listening to someone else's conversation, but when your friend runs behind you and calls your name, you immediately switch your full attention to your friend. Inattentional blindness is when you don't see something because your attention was somewhere else. This happens to us all the time when you're distracted or you're on your phone and your friend goes, "Oh, did you see that?" And you're like, "No." One type of inattentional blindness is change blindness, where you don't notice changes in your environment. Kind of a side note example, but one example of change blindness is kind of those like anomaly games like this one. I think this one's called like Exit something. I forgot the number. Not important. Anyways, basically they put you in an environment and they change little things and they see if you can tell what changed. So that is meant to exercise your change blindness. Let's start off by defining depth cues. A depth cue is something that allows us to perceive our world in 3D. This is really important because in reality, the image formed by our retinas and our eyes is actually in 2D. So to be able to perceive things properly like depth and distance, we need to use our depth cues. Can inattentional blindness be that one video where you have to count the number of passes that white shirts made and there's a gorilla that passes through and you don't see it? That sounds like it. Yes. Yeah, that sounds like a type of inattentional blindness. Okay. Binocular depth cues depend on the use of both of your eyes. For example, retinal disparity is when your brain calculates the distance of an item by comparing the two retinal images. The greater the difference, the closer the item is. Convergence is a binocular depth cue where the brain calculates the angle, the distance of an item by looking at the angle of how much your eyes turned inwards. Monocular depth cues are depth cues that happen individually in each of your eyes. Relative clarity just means that further objects appear with lower clarity, as they might be kind of blurry or fuzzy or just unclear, and closer objects appear with higher clarity. Relative size, that means that if you're looking at something that's far away, you'll have a smaller retinal image of it. However, when we're looking at relative size, you have to make sure that it's relative. So for example, if I am looking at 2 basketballs and one basketball looks smaller, I can say that the smaller basketball is the one that's further away. But obviously I can't use it to compare like a rock and a tiny rock and then a giant boulder. Texture gradients show that when we're looking at a faraway object, it will typically appear smooth. So even when we're looking at smooth objects up close, the texture will be different than the smoothness we get from a faraway object. Linear perspective is all about parallel lines, so kind of like we see right here. As distance increases, the lines will appear to converge until they meet at a point and they disappear. Interposition is when one object blocks another. That way we know that the object that's being blocked is going to be the one that's further away. Perceptual constancy is basically our ability to perceive that something is the same despite our retinal image of it changing. So, for example, let's say you put your laptop on your desk and then you begin to walk backwards away from your laptop. Even though your retinal image of your laptop is changing, you're still able to determine that the laptop itself hasn't changed and is still in the same place that you left it and is still the same size that it always was. There's a ton of types of perceptual constancies like shape, constancy, color constancy, size, brightness, etc. But you don't have to know the specifics. You just have to know that all of those kind of fall under what um, forms your overall perceptual constancy. Apparent movement is when we perceive stationary objects to be moving. A really good example of apparent movement is animations. Animators basically um, they make like frames, right? And the frames themselves, like this bird flying right here, they're stationary. This is a stationary picture. But if I were to flash the images after one another, your brain would perceive that as a continuous movement of the bird's wings. So, can someone think of a different example of apparent movement? Riding in a car, seeing things pass by. I don't know if that counts, but do you mean like you're in the moving car, like still? That would be an example of perceptual constancy because you understand that you're moving, and because you understand that you're moving, your retinal images are changing, but you understand that the objects you're looking at are still in the same place. 4D movies, probably. I don't really know how 4D movies work though. I'm not gonna lie. Oops, I accidentally turned my mic off. Anyways, all I said was that I don't really know much about 4D movies. Um, Flickering light bulbs in electric sign, that's a good example because if it flickers fast enough, your brain can perceive it as just being on the entire time instead of flickering. Other effects to interact with you and make you feel like you're in a movie. Fan spinning really fast. Optical illusions, yeah, I think, well, optical illusions test all kinds of your perception, but I think there would definitely be some that would test apparent movement. Okay, all good examples. Okay, earlier um, I was talking about dogs as an example of my schema. So let's head back to that example. Concepts are basically groups of similar things. So even though we know that there's like a billion different dog breeds, we all categorize all those dog breeds under the concept of dog. Prototypes are the ideal example for a concept. So for a lot of people, I think the prototype of a dog would be probably some kind of Labrador or a Retriever. Let's just use the example of a Golden Retriever because to a lot of people that would be their like first definition of a dog. Algorithms are a type of problem solving where we go step by step to try every possible solution until we find the right one. So this would be me like having a dog in front of me and then searching up every single type of dog breed until I find the one that matches. So algorithms do guarantee, they basically guarantee um, that they're going to be correct. But algorithms are also super inconvenient and unrealistic for humans, so we tend to use heuristics. Heuristics are basically mental shortcuts that we use to make a judgment. For example, because I see a small hairless dog, I might think that it's Chihuahua, when in reality it might be a different kind of small hairless dog breed. Even though heuristics are typically what we use because they help us make judgments quickly, they are also super prone to bias. One type of heuristic is a representative heuristic, where we make our judgments based off of pre existing stereotypes and expectations. For example, I might expect a golden retriever to be really friendly to me based on stereotypes surrounding golden retrievers, but it might bite me. Another type of heuristic is an availability heuristic, which is when we think what will happen is the event that most easily comes to mind. So if I'm something, not if I'm something, if I'm someone who is really scared of dogs, I might think that all dogs are going to bite me. So when I come into contact with a dog, I'm going to think that the most common event that's going to happen is that I'm going to be bit. But hopefully, no, that's not the most common. Um, Earlier we talked about schemas, and my schema of a dog was that it was fluffy, four-legged, and that it barks. I don't think, or I don't know if bears can bark. You're going to pretend right now that bears can bark. So let's say I go to the zoo and then I see a brown bear. It's I'm going to think that that bear is a dog because it fits my schema, and I'm going to add it into my collection of dogs in my mind. That is an example of assimilation because I didn't change my schema, I just used my schema to categorize information into it. Accommodation is when we see something that doesn't match our schema, and so we modify our schema. So let's say I go to the dog park and I see this hairless dog right here. I can update my schema and say that dogs are still four-legged and that they bark, but they're not always fluffy. Can you restate the definition of availability heuristic? Yes. So, um, availability heuristic is when you think the most common outcome is the thing that most commonly comes to your mind. So when you think what's going to happen is the first thing that comes into your head. So if you've been reading a lot of scary stories lately, or you look at a lot of true crime, you might think something bad is going to happen to you based off your availability heuristic, when in reality, it probably won't. So they're very prone to like stereotypes and stuff. Okay, now we're going to talk about the phenomena that impact our decision making. So, mental set is the tendency for us to try solving problems using ways that worked for us in the past, even if the situation is completely different and it might not be well applicable to our current situation. Priming is when previous stimuli can subconsciously influence our future decisions and perceptions. For example, if you watch a really scary movie and then you go to bed later at night, you might think that all the little sounds from your house, like the creaking wood or whatnot, are malicious and threatening and might be something dangerous. Framing is all about how information is worded. Um, the way we're presented with information can alter our future decisions a lot. For example, if I say there's a 10% survival rate of a disease, that sounds a lot better than saying there's a 90% death rate. We see priming a ton in politics because politicians need votes, so they'll frame their campaign in a way to make their issue more dramatic. When we make decisions, there are two prominent kinds of fallacies that we can fall victim to. One is gambler's fallacy. Oh my god, my voice. Okay, one is gambler's fallacy. And you might have like gone to math class and gotten a math question wrong because of gambler's fallacy. Basically, it's when you think that something that keeps repeatedly happening will be less likely to happen the next time. So, for example, if you flip a coin and you get heads 10 times in a row, on your 11th flip, you're going to be like, I'm bound to get tails, like the probability is so low. But in reality, that's an independent probability, right? Mathematically, we know the probability is still 50-50 regardless of what number flip you're on. Sunk cost fallacy is when we make decisions to continue something because we feel like we've invested so much into it, even if that's not the best decision to make, and it might be better to stop investing energy and time into it right now. This happens a lot in relationships, I think. Your executive functions are cognitive processes that allow us to think critically and to work towards a goal. So let's move to this diagram right here. Convergent thinking is a type of thinking where we narrow our possibilities down using logic to find the best solution. An example of convergent thinking is like math, solving a math problem. Divergent thinking is typically what we describe as thinking outside of the box, and that's where we aim to expand our possible solutions. We need to use both types. We also use both types. Creativity is a way of thinking that creates new and novel ideas. Creativity stems from divergent thinking. Functional fixedness is a cognitive bias where we don't imagine items to be usable outside of their traditional functions. Our creativity is oftentimes limited by functional fixedness because we can't imagine using an item in a different way. Convergent thinking, like order of elimination on an MCQ question. Yeah, I think that's a good example. Okay. Let's talk about all the types of memory that you need to know. So, explicit memory is also called declarative memory, and those are memories that we consciously need to put effort in to recall. Two types of explicit memory are episodic memory and semantic memory. Episodic memories are all of our personal experiences, so that would be something like remembering a family vacation. Semantic memory is general knowledge and facts, so a lot of things that we learn in school are semantic memory. Implicit memories are learned skills or associations that work automatically and unconsciously when we think. So, one type of implicit memory is procedural memory, which are kind of habits. Um, Examples of procedural memory would be something like riding a bike or typing on a keyboard. After you learn how to do those things and you get used to doing them, you do them without thinking very much. The phrase muscle memory typically refers to procedural memory. Prospective memory is related to the future and actions you plan to do in the future. So, for example, me remembering that I have to go to class is a type of prospective memory. Long-term potentiation helps us describe memory at a physiological level. So it basically tells us that the more you repeat an action, the stronger the synaptic connections between neurons related to that action will become. So the more you use a neural pathway, the stronger that pathway gets. If I'm learning to ride a bike, the more I practice riding, the stronger the related synaptic connections will be. And that way, the action of me riding the bike will be easier and more automatic in the future. This is the working memory model by, I think it's Badley and Hitch. I don't see how else you could say that, but I don't know their names. Um, Anyways, let's start by defining working memory itself. So, working memory is the active system that's processing your incoming information and it's storing it for a short amount of time so that you're able to perform your tasks. It has a limited capacity, so if you're working on something like a math problem set, Your working memory won't be able to store information from the previous problem that you just solved because it's no longer active and it's going to focus on the problem that you're currently solving. The working memory model proposes that our working memory has multiple components that work together. Your central executive function is basically the control center and is what controls your working memory. It tells information where to go, and it also directs your attention to what you should focus on. Your phonological loop is what processes auditory and linguistic information, and your visual spatial sketchpad processes visual and spatial components. Those are the only three parts of the working memory model that you really need to know, but the um, episodic buffer basically combines all the information coming from your long-term knowledge and your phonological loop and your visual spatial sketchpad, and it gives that back to the central executive so that it can work. Okay, here's the multi-store model, which is also known as the Atkinson-Shiffrin, I hope it's Shiffrin, model. Um, the first stage here is sensory memory. Sensory memory is super short-lived, like it literally lasts less than a second. Iconic memory is just your visual sensory memory, and echoic memory is your auditory sensory memory. Short-term memory lasts a couple of minutes. Normally it can last up to like 8 or 10 minutes. If short-term memory is transferred to long-term memory, depends on encoding. So if it gets here, it depends on if you encode it or not. So repeating a word over and over again will keep something in your short-term memory because that's maintenance rehearsal, like we see right here, but it's not meaningful enough to be encoding and to turn that short-term memory into long-term memory. Typically, when we encode, you have to attach some sort of meaning to it, at least some sort of level of meaning. We can encode through automatic and effortful processing. Automatic just meaning that it's kind of intuitive, and then effortful is that we try to get it into our long-term memory by practicing it, whatnot. The way we encode can impact how well information is stored or retrieved. Retrieval is the process of bringing long-term memory into our short-term memory. This doesn't mean that the long-term memory permanently becomes short-term memory and then disappears, just that because we're actively using the information, it's going to be short-term memory temporarily so that we can use it. So would having short-term memory loss mean not being able to create new long-term memories? I think yes. I'm fairly certain yes, because that is what happens. Yeah, actually, it is yes, because that's what happens in early stages of Alzheimer's, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. You do need working short-term memory to be able to encode it into long-term memory. Okay, let's use an example for the entire multi-store model. So let's say I'm learning about cats in class. I'm going to have both an iconic memory and an echoic memory of the cat depicted on the slideshow and my teacher speaking. However, if I wasn't paying attention, my learning ends there. You can see that right here, that unattended information is lost. Maybe I write down the definition in my notes and I do a quick practice problem. Now I've transferred the information into my long-term memory because I just worked to encode it. A week later, let's say I have a test coming up and there's going to be cats on it. So maybe I'll do flashcards or ask my teacher about it to retrieve the long-term memory into my short-term memory. While I'm doing these activities, it's temporarily going to be in the short-term memory, but then it'll return back into my long-term memory. Obviously, after that, I can forget it, but yeah. Okay, this is the levels of processing mode. It organizes encoding from shallow to deep processing. Shallow processing would be something like maintenance rehearsal, something that doesn't have a lot of meaning or a lot of effort attached to it. Deep processing does have meaning and effort attached to it. Deeper processing tends to lead to better long-time retention. From shallow to deep, you're going to have structural, phonetic, and then semantic. Okay, more on how we encode memories. Like we said earlier, how information is encoded determines how effectively information is stored and retrieved. So here are some methods of encoding that will increase how well information is stored and retrieved. The first is the use of mnemonic devices. Typically, people think of mnemonic devices as making an acronym for something, but it's actually a really big umbrella term. Method of loci is a type of mnemonic device where you associate information with specific locations. So, for example, you should be really familiar with like the layout and the rooms in your house. So you can assign each room to a specific piece of information, and that will help you encode and recall information. Sometimes we call this a memory palace or a memory castle. Um, I've heard different things. Okay, chunking is when we break down information into smaller pieces. A really good example of chunking is the use of phone numbers. When we think of phone numbers, we typically memorize it as the first three letters, the first three numbers, and then the next three numbers, and then the last four numbers, instead of the entire number all at once. Um, the spacing effect tells us that practicing a little bit multiple times over a period of time will lead to better long-term retention than just trying to practice it all at once. That's why after you cram for an exam, after the exam, you'll probably forget most of the material. The serial position effect is basically just the primacy and recency effect combined. It tells us that information presented first and last is going to be more memorable than information that was presented in the middle. Lawyers use and abuse the serial position effect so much. There is actually a type of psychology called jury psychology. It's super interesting and it combines the principles of forensic and sociocultural psychology to convince a jury. Okay, maintenance rehearsal is when we are able to prolong the time that memory is stored by rehearsing it. Elaborative rehearsal is a type of rehearsal that aims to make connections instead of just like repeating something or writing down notes over and over again, so it will typically be more effective. Some people have superior, which means that they're able to remember their personal experiences very clearly and for very long amounts of time. So if I ask you what you ate for breakfast 3 weeks ago, you probably wouldn't be able to tell me. But if I ask someone with superior autobiographical memory, they might be able to tell me. This indicates to us that superior memory may have some biological functions attached to it, but we're still not sure. Additionally, autobiographical memory tends to be more memorable for all people, not just those with superior memory. So that means we tend to remember our own experiences and things pertaining to us easier. Sometimes conditions can arise when someone has trouble storing memories. This can be because they have trouble maintaining or they have trouble retrieving from their long-term memories. Amnesia is an umbrella term for memory loss, so it's both a symptom and it's a condition. Retrograde amnesia is forgetting memories that were formed in the past. So if someone gets a concussion, they can have retrograde amnesia where they forget what happened right before the injury, which is actually super common for most minor concussions. Anterograde amnesia is where someone loses the ability to form new memories. Fugu, I'm pretty sure that's how it's pronounced, is a really rare type of dissociative amnesia where someone loses all sense of personal identity and they travel to a new place. Typically, it lasts just as an episode and is a result of trauma or intense stress. Infantile amnesia describes our inability to remember things that happened in our early childhood. So we can't really remember stuff that happened to us until we were like 3 or 4 years old. Alzheimer's is a neurodegenerative disorder that starts with issues in short term memory and later progress into issues with long term memory. What do you mean travel to a new place? So, if you just lose your sense of identity, that doesn't count as fugue. Fugue is paired with you like leaving your home. So, some people have like interpreted it as like a psychotic break where someone experiences something traumatic and so they also lose their sense of home and they typically leave it to go somewhere else. So fugue has to be paired with losing your sense of identity and leaving your home, going somewhere else, establishing that as your home or whatnot. Otherwise, it's just going to be dissociative amnesia. Okay. We already talked a little bit about retrieval, but memories can be retrieved through recall or recognition. Recall is basically like an FRQ problem, where you have to come up with the answer without any hints, just from like, I guess, raw memory is how I would describe it. Recognition is like an MCQ problem, where you have to be able to recognize the answer, but you're also given hints and context. There is a couple ways that we can enhance our memory retrieval. Starting off with context dependent memory. This tells us that we tend to remember information better in the same environment that we learned in. Mood congruent memory tells us we're more likely to remember information if it matches our current mood. So if I'm really upset, I might remember something bad that happened to me a really long time ago. But if I was in a good mood, I probably would have never remembered it at all. State-dependent memory says that we are more likely to remember information when our body is in the same state that we learned it in. An example of that is if I learned something when I was really sleepy and tired, the next time I become sleepy and tired, it might be easier for me to remember it. The testing effect is basically when we force ourselves to actively recall information, which will lead to stronger memory. That is why it's good to quiz ourselves or to take practice tests instead of just reading notes over and over again. Metacognition is basically thinking about our thinking. An example of metacognition is if I'm learning something and I put conscious effort into thinking about how hard a question was for me or how hard it was for me to memorize something, that way it can help me learn better in the future. Is an example of context-dependent memory nostalgia? Yeah, that's a really good one. So if you're in the same place where you used to be, that can be a form of context-dependent memory. Okay. This is Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve. It shows us how quickly we forget information if we don't review it. After initial exposure to learning something, we forget 50% of it within one day, which we can see right here, it drops to 50%. If we want to be able to retain the majority of information, we need to be rehearsing the information. The forgetting curve also demonstrates the spacing effect, which we talked about earlier, said that it was better to repeat information multiple times, because as you see here, even if I do it, like even if I repeat it, it drops down to 30. So it's better to repeat multiple times than to just repeat once because you're going to forget more. Yeah, there's a session tomorrow at 7 p.m. EST. It's going to be Unit 3. Okay. There are a variety of reasons that some memories can be hard to retrieve. One is an encoding failure, which basically means that you never effectively stored the information in the first place. So this is something that can be caused by inattention. Like if you were distracted by learning something, we said that it never even really stayed in your short-term memory. Interference is when your memories can basically block each other from being retrieved effectively. So, proactive interference is when old information prevents you from remembering new information, and retroactive interference is when new information prevents you from remembering old information. Inadequate retrieval is when the information is stored, but you need kind of a cue or a hint to be able to retrieve it. One example of inadequate retrieval is the tip of the tongue phenomenon, where you know the word but you just can't seem to retrieve it. Or like you know what you want to describe, you can't figure out what it is, etc. The psychodynamic theory suggests that forgetting can be because our mind is subconsciously trying to suppress painful memories in order to protect us. You mean for like you want one for each type of interference? Okay. So, an example of proactive interference, let's say you started a new job and you have like your old boss's name and you have your new boss's name. Proactive proactive interference would be like you accidentally calling your new boss your old boss's name. And then retroactive interference would be like when you're struggling to remember your new boss's name because you keep thinking of your old boss's name. Oh no, that's the backwards. Oh my god. Okay, my proactive interference was right. Retroactive would be you can't remember your old boss's name because you keep thinking about your new boss's name. Yeah, sorry. Oh my god. Okay. Proactive is um, you can't remember your new boss's name because you keep thinking about your old boss. And then retroactive is when you can't remember your old boss's name because you keep thinking about your new boss's name. Does that help? Oh my god, I get tongue tied, I swear. Can another example be learning a new language? Yeah, that's also an example. Like you can mix up words from each language. Encoding failure is like tip of the tongue, right? No. Tip of the tongue is an adequate retrieval where it's you know the information but you just need a hint to get it. Encoding failure is it's like you never properly learn the information in the first place. So you can't retrieve it because it's not even there, like you don't even know it. Yeah, you didn't process it properly. Okay. Um, do you need to take a screenshot? Actually, I'm gonna publish it later, so just ask me if you need the link. So sometimes we remember information, but we remember it incorrectly. The misinformation effect is proposed by Elizabeth Loftus in her car crash study. It tells us that if we're presented with misleading or inaccurate information after an event, that can alter our memory of the event, even if we didn't mean it to. Like, we don't mean to lie, it just literally warped our memory. So basically, Loftus and her team showed people the video of the exact same car crash, but they used different verbs like smashed versus hit when asking people how fast the cars collided. So people who were asked using more aggressive verbs like smashed remember the collision being faster than it actually was, as opposed to people who got like bumped. So if you got the word like bumped, you would have said, oh, they crashed at, you know what, like 20 miles per hour. But if you got smashed, you'd be like, they crashed at 60 miles per hour. Source amnesia is when we remember information correctly, but you don't remember where it came from. This is really important in terms of how other people perceive the information you gave them. Constructive, constructive memory is the idea that we're missing pieces of information, and so our brain will fill in the blanks based on our prior knowledge, even if it's not accurate. Memory consolidation is when new memories become long term. During this process, we can modify the memory and accidentally make it inaccurate. Imagination inflammation is a phenomenon where we repeatedly imagine the exact same scenario, and the more we imagine it, the more confident we become that it actually happened. Isn't that framing too the misinformation effect? No, because framing is perception, and then misinformation effect impacts memory. So it's not just your perception of the memory, but it literally changes what you remember happening. Remember my example with like someone telling you someone was mean, and then you going into a conversation with them and talking to them, and you thinking what they said was mean when it actually was? Oh, like how the experimenters told the people how severe it was. Oh, yeah, that's a type of framing. Yeah, that would be an example of it, but the study itself isn't, because, yeah, okay. So that's a good point that framing can cause the misinformation effect. Okay. Throughout history, we have constantly argued over how to define and measure intelligence. A really big debate regarding intelligence is if intelligence is a general ability. I've never seen that. College board uses that apparently. You'll probably not see that though. They argue if over intelligence is a general ability or if it's a combination of multiple abilities. In early intelligence testing, we would have an intelligence quotient or your IQ. Your IQ was mathematically your mental age divided by your chronological age, then multiplied by 100. Today, we use IQ to help us determine children with possible learning disabilities. Um, I'm gonna come out of the gate right now and say that most of the IQ tests you see online are not valid and not useful because they do not follow these principles. Validity is how well something measures what it's supposed to measure. So we have constructive validity and predictive validity. Constructive validity measures to what extent the test measured the trait it was supposed to. So how well did the IQ test measure IQ? Um, con- I just did that. Predictive validity looks at if the test can predict future outcomes, like if I can use an IQ test to predict how intelligent someone will be in the future, or how well they'll do in school in the future. Standardized just means that the test needs to be given consistently in a similar, if not identical, way to all the test takers. Is validity accuracy? Um, I wouldn't. I would say that all three of these contribute to a test's accuracy. More like. Good question. Okay. Reliability looks at if the test can provide consistent results. We can test reliability using test retest, which is where we make the same person take the test at two different times, and they should get the same score both times. Split half is when the results of the first half of the test should match the results from the second half. The Flynn effect describes how scores of intelligence tests have increased over time. These are basically all different kinds of intelligence tests. The Flynn effect is caused by an increase in education, better nutrition, etc., things that just come as our countries have developed in healthcare, education, whatnot. By the way, these are just all different kinds of tests. Okay, so based off what we just talked about, what does the Flynn effect imply about IQ tests? The Flynn effect has been found to be reversing now due to AI. That's that's interesting. Um, can someone answer my question? What does the Flynn effect imply about IQ tests? Increased IQ average. Um, yes, but that's not like an implication, I don't think. Okay, I think I just worded my question badly. Um, this was meant to be the answer. Oh, wait, someone had an answer. The generations have gotten smarter, I guess. This was the answer I was looking for, which is that intelligence tests can be, I meant to say impacted by, can be impacted by socioeconomic factors. Because, like we talked about, as time went on, IQ increased. But did it actually? Probably not, right? Like, intelligence itself probably didn't like double in a couple of years, which means that intelligence tests are susceptible to being influenced by socioeconomic factors. Okay, building off of that question, we found that IQ scores actually vary more within a group than between groups. This shows us that one, individuals are incredibly unique, and two, group differences are smaller than people typically assume. So, despite discrimination sometimes portraying some groups as being less intelligent than others, we found that to be false. What does the Flynn effect imply? IQ tests. Oh, oops. Okay. Additionally, there are also some inequities that can lower someone's IQ scores. Poverty, discrimination, and educational inequities are all factors that can negatively impact someone's IQ score just based on the way intelligence tests are written. So, let's say an intelligence test is written with a Western psychological perspective in mind. So, someone from the eastern side of the world, especially if the IQ test is based on interpretation of words in English, someone from the eastern side of the world is probably going to get a lower score, which is a type of bias in IQ testing. Because of that, using IQ to limit someone's opportunities is misuse and unethical because there could be so many different kinds of biases and factors at play. Historically, the US has used IQ tests to limit people from taking certain jobs, um, getting promoted to certain military ranks, education, and immigration into the US. Which is why using IQ tests to say that some countries cannot govern themselves is unethical. In terms of discrimination, yes. I think it was just a type of intelligence test, no? And then they use that to, based on what I just told you, hopefully, um, they probably use that to either reject entrance into the military or like limit you to specific ranks. Obviously, I don't know. That's my assumption. Okay, so in education, we typically use either achievement tests or we use aptitude tests. Achievement tests are like the typical tests and exams you get in school. They're used to gauge how much knowledge you know. Aptitude tests are like those diagnostic tests you take once a year for your school, and those tests predict how you'll perform in the future. So, for example, the diagnostic test for my school was an aptitude test that predicted my ACT score. Your academic achievement can be impacted by what kind of mindset you have regarding your intelligence. Fixed mindset is a view that thinks intelligence is determined from the point you were born and cannot be changed. Growth mindset views intelligence as something that's malleable and can be improved through learning. People with a growth mindset typically have higher academic achievement than those with fixed mindsets because they have higher resilience to making mistakes. Someone with a fixed mindset will be easily discouraged from making a mistake. So, AP exams are achievement tests and aptitude tests are like PSAT. I don't know what the PSAT is, so I'm not going to be able to tell you, but I can tell you that the AP exam is a achievement test. Practice SAT. Yeah, that's still gonna be achievement. I'm pretty sure, because it's not like a looking into the future thing. Like it's not predictive. Okay, I have a really quick look at because that was all the material we had to cover. So, super. Am I supposed to do this before I do the Blooket? Doesn't matter. I don't think so. While I set up my Blooket, can you guys fill this out? Because I need a second. The Blooket is pretty short. It's probably gonna last like 10, 8, 10 minutes. Host. What's like the normal one? Classic. Do you guys care what we play? I'm just gonna do classic. Okay, let's just do classic. It basically looks like Kahoot. Um, there's 10 questions, so yeah. Questions will be presented in a random order, but only repeating questions after all have been answered equally. What does that mean? Okay, I don't know what that means. Oh, I'm confused. Oh my god, what is this music? I need to change my screen share so that you guys can see it. Um, this. Can you guys see that? Okay. You don't see anything? I shared my screen again. No? Are you laggy? I have people joining. Here, you know what? I'll just send you the code, actually, in chat. 145462. If anyone needs it. It's okay. I think you're gonna win, honestly. Okay, I'll give it like 1 more minute, but just type in chat if you don't get in or something, I guess. Okay. Hopefully you guys get all the same questions at the same time, but I'm not sure. Okay, some of us put retroactive interference. So retroactive would be um, you not being able to remember the old phone number because you keep thinking about the new phone number. Yes. Okay, some of us say bottom up processing. Bottom up is when um, you use your sensory details, but top down, because we're using previous knowledge, including the context clues, that's a form of top down processing. Um, Metacognition is when you think about how you think. We talked about that already. And then perceptual set is your expectations in the future. Okay. Um, okay, relative size we talked about has to be based on two pretty similar objects. So it's like the basketball and the basketball, right? This, we didn't even talk about size. Like, we didn't even say which one was smaller or bigger. Convergence is the parallel line thing, where we have that big, long, straight road, and the lines converge at the end, and then they disappear at the same point. Binocular depth cues um, are depth cues that depend on both eyes, so that's retinal disparity and, ooh, what's the other one? Hold on. That's, um, oh, and convergence. But interposition is the right answer. Yeah, convergence is based on the angle that you're. Mm, wait, I said that wrong. I did not mean to say the line thing. The line thing is linear perspective. Convergence is when the eyes like physically go inwards. It's based on the angle of how inwards your eyes turn. So when you're looking at something closer to you, your eyes are going to turn in more. When you're looking at something far away, your eyes are not going to turn in as much. Interposition is the correct one because something is blocking the other thing. So the thing being blocked is going to be the further away thing. Okay. Also, interposition is a monocular depth cue, not a binocular one. You quit? Why? Well, um, it's going to be availability heuristic. Representative heuristic is based on like stereotypes and stuff. So okay, accommodation. This is accommodation because I changed my schema. Assimilation would be like if I just shoved penguin in as a bird, but I didn't actually change my schema. So I would be like birds are based on this schema plus penguins. There's also penguins. But here I changed my schema to fit penguins, which is why it's accommodation. I'm accommodating for penguins. Yeah, I think this is just something that you have to memorize, unfortunately. But structural is vision, phonetic is hearing or auditory, semantic is meaning. For whoever clicked green, split half reliability is if I take half of the test now and I take the other half another time, um, I should get the same score on both. Yeah, it is. Tip of the tongue phenomenon is within the umbrella term of one of these four umbrella terms. So, interference was the thing with memory where one of your memory blocks another. And encoding failure was when you didn't process the information properly. Um, Guys, so not divergent thinking. Divergent thinking would be what Ariel is doing. Ariel is not the student. Divergent thinking is also not a cognitive bias, so we clearly didn't read our question carefully. Because divergent thinking is a way of thinking, not a cognitive bias. Um, Functional fixedness is when you only think that one object can be used in the traditional way, which we see here. The student thinks it can only be used for eating. Also, a reminder that functional fixedness is something that limits creativity. Also, the complete opposite of divergent thinking. This is an example of convergent. Don't look at the grammar issues on this. Yeah, this is anterograde amnesia, because he cannot make new memories. Retrospective amnesia is when you can't remember things that happened in the past. I can't talk either. Okay, well, oops, stop sharing. Okay, I'm just gonna open up Q&A for like a couple of minutes now. If you guys have any more questions or you have questions from the game we just played. Too chuddy. Why is your name Too Chuddy now instead of your other name? Do mermaids have the same brains? I think all of these questions about mermaids made me put Ariel into my example, like subconsciously. You're like subconsciously shifting my memory. Could you please send the slides? Yes, I will do that right after I end this. Mermaids use forks as hairbrushes instead of eating. In The Little Mermaid, they did. Does anyone have real questions? I'll be sure to send you the slides though. ABQs and AAQs? Um, no. At least I won't. Someone can volunteer to, but it's not going to be me. I don't understand semantics. Is that something I think not, but I haven't read the rest of the CED yet, but I will get back to you. But I believe not. If someone suffers a stroke and they have difficulty removing episodic memories, will they also have difficulty recovering semantic memories? Oh, difficulty recovering. If someone suffers a stroke and they have difficulty recovering episodic memories, will they also have difficulty recovering semantic memories? Not always. You can have dissociative amnesia. Although that typically, no, that can be caused by trauma to the brain. Yeah, so not always, because dissociative amnesia, they would forget, they would have problems recovering episodic memory, but they would probably still be able to recover some of their semantic. Okay, good, you're not wrong. Okay, stop. Okay, never mind. If there's no more questions, then thank you for coming, and I will see you tomorrow at the same time for Unit 3.